Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubinstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restory the culture together.
Hey everybody, this is Tanya, and welcome back to another episode of Restoring the Culture with my dear friend Camille Adair and me. And today we are going to talk about radically restoring 2020 and what that means to us. And Camille's going to start with a little passage from Victor Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning.
But in robbing the present of its reality, there lay a certain danger. It became easy to overlook the opportunities to make something positive of camp life, opportunities which really did exist. Leaves me speechless, right?
Amazing. Yeah, it is like leaving us speechless. Sort of not unlike this year, right?
There's a lot of speechlessness. And I mean, to think if you could find a silver lining in living in a concentration camp, surely we can find silver linings for 2020 with the pandemic, with massive fires, with many deaths from the pandemic, with social isolation and the wave of depression that's resulting from that, increased suicides, right? I mean, we can paint the dark picture, but what's underneath it that's wanting to get our attention? I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, thanks for asking. It's such a huge topic that we're biting off here. And I just want to say to our listeners, as always, there's no dogma here. There's no agenda here. We just let you all in on our personal exploration, which is what Camille and I have been doing in our friendship for 20 years. So, I mean, it's a humbling thing. It's interesting that you chose Victor Frankl because I've been rereading Elie Wiesel's Night and Day, also concentration camp memoirs. I'm thinking about the children at the border and concentration camps, and also reading about the forced sterilization of people of color, women of color in Georgia. And just what's happening in this moment, right? So I just want to first acknowledge this moment, September 20th, 2020, a couple days after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, that being in the news.
Also, right after Rosh Hashanah.
Right after Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. So, and in the midst of it all, we're 45 or 46 days from the U.S. presidential election. So why are we both being called to return to Holocaust stories now? It's like...
Well, I think about Stephen.
Yeah.
If we restory what's going on personally, right? I mean, that takes me to the personal.
Well, it's very interesting. So, Stephen was my daughter's father. And he committed suicide in the last 3 weeks ago today. And he had schizoaffective disorder. He was Jewish from LA, sort of the nice Jewish boy stereotype or trope or whatever, but he really was that, very, very brilliant. And his family had Holocaust trauma on his father's side. I think this is what I want to say about all of it, what I want to come back to when you ask me that question. Okay, there's trauma. We are a traumatized society. We're a traumatized culture. We're a traumatized species. And I think about like the Peter Levine work about in our animal self and our nervous systems, how animals have been attending to their trauma. And because of our mindset and because of things we talk about, patriarchy, white supremacy, and on, colonization, all the things that have kept us in boxes and how those things traumatize us individually and collectively. So how do we seek liberation in the camps while holding space to get out of the camps? How do we open to liberation in the prison of our trauma while walking our way out of that trauma to the best of our ability?
I guess I'm curious to know, in what way have you been released from a concentration camp since Stephen died?
Such a great question. Well, the love was liberated. The mental illness and his trauma played into my own trauma. When I lost my daughter's father, and it was in a very traumatic circumstance, and what it did was it triggered my trauma, and I started getting panic attacks. I stopped performing my own one-woman shows. I became afraid to speak about my life publicly on stage when that had been my art form before. And I became terrified that something would happen to my daughter. It felt life or death to me. When I saw what happens with schizophrenics, when I saw there was no Stephen in his eyes, and he was trying to strangle me on my daughter's 4th birthday. And that was not who he was in any shape or form. You know, I said to you earlier, he was the least racist, most feminist, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, least homophobic, white, cis, straight man I ever met. He was truly committed to social justice. He had been an anti-apartheid advocate when he was in Berkeley as a young man. And he was just so about justice and about love. But when I lost him, and this is the hell of mental illness, when you're on the other side of it, and of course for the person is we lose the ability to access. But what happened was that trauma cut off my voice. And like I was saying to you, as soon as he died, there was total grief. I smashed my finger really hard the night and had to go to the emergency room the night before he jumped. That same night. And I smashed my grandmother's wedding ring that I always wore, the diamonds, into my finger, and it was bleeding and had to be cut off by the doctor. And a few hours later, he jumped. And there was some kind of cosmic connection, and I screamed when that finger was hurt. I screamed like this hellacious scream that I only remember screaming twice before, and once had to do with his suicide attempt before.
Oh, wow.
So I think we're all cosmically connected. I know it. I know it in my being. I think the support from the other side of the veil is greater than it's ever been, teaching us, showing me personally, that the connection and the love is always there. All the ancestral work both you and I have done, all the personal healing work, like to come to that the love's always there and that we can move back and forth across the bridge. And I love what Victor Frankl says, and Elie Wiesel too, in a different story, but this thing of the opportunity of the present moment, even in the worst of circumstances, to me, that's radical resilience. So how in 2020, the year people are calling the hell year, how can we restore it to see the incredible opportunities to be in service to each other, to love each other more at this time?
Well, it's interesting as I hear you talk, one of the ways that I wonder about this restoring for you and for me, I met Stephen, fortunately, knew him before his mental illness, set in. One of the things that strikes me is that you refer to him as the father of your daughter. He was your husband. And I remember that hit me when you told me that he died, that he suicided. I remember, for as sad as I was for your daughter, I was sad for you because you lost a husband who you divorced only because of his untreated mental illness. You didn't divorce Stephen. You divorced his mental illness.
It's a very interesting thing you are saying. And because I was thinking yesterday, I wrote something up and I said, I don't have a problem with white people. I have a problem with whiteness. I don't have a problem, I never did with Stephen. I have the problem with mental illness. If we can separate out the toxicity, whether it's individual or cultural, and of course, it's not just toxicity. That sounds so harsh. It's a byproduct of trauma, all of it.
Well, and because of that, every race has that trauma.
Which absolutely,
that's the thing that makes it really hard in how we language all of this, right?
It's why I'm reading this book right now, My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about racialized trauma and the pathways to mending our hearts and bodies. And it talks about the different things we need to do if we're in white bodies versus black bodies, because it's all DNA memory from our ancestors.
Right. And that's different.
It takes on a different tone and tenor.
That's right. That makes a lot of sense to me.
And just like schizophrenia takes on a different tenor than somebody who loses somebody to drug addiction or somebody who loses somebody to cancer. There's a loss in all those things, but there's a different human story, right, attached to it, which is why, once again, the thing you and I talk about, the as above, so below path. But yes, and Stephen was my husband. He was my best friend, for sure. We shared values in a profound way, which was the only reason I agreed to have a child with him. I wasn't sure I wanted a child. I wasn't one of those women that always knew they'd have a child. It was his idea. And I was 32 and I got pregnant. And the love, once again, is released, and I feel him helping me. And you were the one that said to me, it's like after 19 years of losing him to mental illness, I got the other parent back.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you have him back.
I have him back as the other parent. And I do want to say that was always more our natural relationship, was friendship and co-parent. It wasn't some big love affair on either side. There was love, but we felt familial. Immediately when we met, we felt so deeply familial. And in many ways, I'd say, yeah, definitely like co-parents and best friends. And so that's the honest energy of us. And I can own the honest energy of us because I think we spent a lot of time. We had problems besides his schizophrenia. That was what took us down. But there was definitely a trying to make our relationship a big love affair, and it wasn't. And so there's something too about like that was conflict in our relationship that had nothing to do with his mental illness. We were great co-parents and best friends, and we have a beautiful daughter together, a beautiful, brilliant daughter.
So I wonder, what is the relationship? I mean, I'm not saying there's an answer to this, because the most profound wisdom is, I think, in these days is held in the unknown. Mm-hmm. But I guess I want to skirt the edges of an inquiry, which is feeling into the relationship between COVID and the timing of Stephen's death.
Well, then I want to hear from you the relationship between COVID and everything that's changing in your life. Because yes, like Well, people are saying 2020, right, is the worst year, the year from hell. And I would say through the ego's lens, that's the truth. I mean, from the soul's lens and from the long story's lens, because that's what we're here for, right? The long story. My friend and teacher right now, Perdita Finn, talks all the time about the long story of the soul and all the threads, past, present, future, quantum time, no matter what's going on in the body. So in the long story, I feel like 2020 is a blessing. I could never say it will be a blessing that my daughter's father was in that much pain, and that he had to end his life, felt he had to end his life that way. But the liberation that I feel personally, and that knowing he's also free of that suffering, I feel like there's an out breath. And I was talking with his mother about it, like that we're all taking an out breath, because, we know how the story ends now. And there's something holding with that's so hard. And I think it's a metaphor for this time. The tension, part of what the tension of those 19 years did teach me was holding with the tension, not knowing the ending of the story. And it's hard to hold with that tension. And then the story changed, right? It didn't really end. It changed.
Well, it reminds me of The Living Dead. I mean, I think it's that way with people, who have Alzheimer's or dementia.
Yes.
People with severe mental illness, untreated mental illness, people with, late stage substance abuse, addiction.
Yes, exactly.
I think it's like the person left a long time ago. And so what you are left with is this body that is acting things out in certain ways, and a voice that may still sound like them. And of course, their soul is still there in some way, but the relationship that we had was interrupted.
Exactly. And they become unavailable for a long time for the relationship. And it's actually in the release of the body that the love, the availability comes back. So for me, in terms of 2020, right, so many deaths. And I think we're seeing the death culture we live in, the extreme materialism, the extreme pressure on us all to do something, be something, the struggles, and where it's taken us at this moment in humanity around the big issues and the intimacy issues. So I don't know, but I just know, for me, that there's a clarity, and I have my voice back in a way, and I feel him supporting me. And so what happens, like Victor Frankl and the camps, what happens when the worst happens and there is still this opportunity for incredible blessing through connection, right? That's what can't be taken. If we have connection with ourselves and with each other.
I think that's been the silver lining for me, even though the process has been hard, very hard at times, is that it's forced me inward, right? It's like I was traveling a lot. I had a lot of ways in which I had developed really sophisticated coping mechanisms for some things that were difficult for me to face. And we all do that, right? I mean, it's not a bad thing. That's like kind of some part of human brilliance, is that we find our ways, right? And then to be someone who loves to travel and loves to engage with a lot of people. And then here I am in my, what is it? It's like maybe 14 by 14 foot office where I spend most of my time. And so it has definitely driven me inside of myself. And I have to be careful, right, that I don't get lost. But I also feel like, we've been moving in such a different direction in our culture, right? We've been doing this inflationary move for so long around get bigger, get louder, be more visible, right? And I feel like something's happened for me where I'm going into this reverse place. And and it's happening organically. It's not been something I've contemplated. It just is happening because of the circumstances, but it's become so deep for me that it's like I'm going into almost like a gestational phase.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really good. I mean, I think that that's really the blessing of it, right?
It's amazing. And you and I talked about it's almost like we're like the sliding doors, because I realize part of me really went small. And small for me doesn't necessarily look like small for somebody else. Like somebody could look at me and say, that's not small, that's big. But for me, I contained for 19 years. And it was a big deal when I stopped performing and felt a lot of fear about what had always come naturally to me and what I'd been trained in as an actor. And I know that right now, as you're going in, my call is to show up with my team now in the world and to lean all the way in with my voice and what I've learned and what I've integrated. And all of a sudden, there's a congruency in my voice that hasn't been there before. There was like fragmented, I had parts of myself, but I actually feel that I have my whole self back. Maybe for the first time since I was a young child.
You know, it's interesting when I think about, because you said you lost your voice when Stephen's mental illness came in to play, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there are many ways in which the soul can become entangled. Mm-hmm. And it's not just past and future, it can be in the present. But it almost makes me wonder if part of you was occupying a space with Stephen, and that's part of where your voice went, was sort of in accompanying him in a way where he was at. Like, could there have been almost some kind of an entanglement in the present moment that isn't about time, but it is about space and conditions, right?
Yes. There totally was, and you're so intuitive to ask that question, because what I got, and I haven't said to anybody out loud, was when he tried to strangle me because his schizophrenia had kicked in. He was looking in my eyes and tried to strangle me and kill me on my daughter's 4th birthday. And somebody had to stop driving by and pull him off. And from my point of view, there was no conflict. And I looked in his eyes and I went, oh, Stephen's gone mad. There's no Stephen there. He didn't have his diagnosis yet. Nobody believed me, but I knew. There was something that was, I'm cautious with my words here, because it's not going to sound maybe politically correct, but there was an energy in him that was very evil. It looked like a demon to me. Mm. And I met its gaze, because it wasn't Stephen. I met this energy's gaze. And the night Stephen died, when I said my finger was smashed and I yelled, there was that energy came out of me in the scream, and it scared my current husband. And I felt it come through my eyes, and I looked at Sid like Stephen looked at me. And I was like, some part of me, I swallowed part of the energy perhaps for him. And it was suppressing me. I mean, it was wild. And then when I heard about his death, I knew immediately the energy that had come out of me the night before, that like in quantum time before he jumped, I was released from that energy.
It makes a lot of sense. And, it's interesting because in one of the traditions I work in, schizophrenia, the cause of schizophrenia is an identification with both the victim and the perpetrator.
Well, and Stephen told me, getting back to the Holocaust, I had a very, very strong belief and a past life memory that I was put to death in the camps as a Jewish Polish woman. Stephen had a very strong belief that he was a Nazi guard in the camps.
Really? Well, what's really interesting when we think back on Victor Frankl, that was his sanity, was that he didn't identify with the perpetrators. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He also didn't identify with the victims. He stayed Victor. So, how do we remain who we are amidst all of the turmoil that's happening in the world and stay ourselves. When we identify with the victim or the perpetrator, it's like we don't even recognize that we literally have stepped in to some kind of like a toxic field.
Perdita would call it a puddle. She calls it like we step in the puddle of our issue and our ancestral issue, perhaps. And certainly for me, that has happened with particularly my activist self, like around Black Lives Matter and my relationship to really decolonizing myself in whiteness. But there was a point when I over-identified with Black women's pain. And then when I realized when I did that, I was out of my power. I was actually out of even being useful to them. And I was re-traumatizing myself. I also wasn't in deep relationship then. And I can always tell on social media, like white women who are just sort of like, I just want to say kissing ass to Black women. And they're out of their power. They just think, now I got to give all my power away. I can't. And when the reality is, it's not an intimate relationship unless we can actually address these things and talk about them, right? So there's so many ways, so many puddles we can step in and be outside of our integrity around the power we do carry and being honest about it because of our over-identification with the victim or the perpetrator. And I do think in our culture, we celebrate over-identification with victimhood. It's really hard to support ourselves and each other in standing actually and owning our full power, right? You and I have talked about this.
Well, identifying with the victim leads to entitlement, and then we become the perpetrator.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it really is, they really are on the same continuum.
Yes.
They're not separate continuums. They're completely related.
It's a different paradigm, and we move back and forth between victim, perpetrator, and inner victim, outer perpetrator, outer victim, right? It's a different paradigm to say, I'm here with my ancestors, I'm here in right relationship, or willing to become in right relationship with everybody.
Right.
I mean, and it's messy. I do want to say, it's not a linear process in my experience.
Right.
So what else do you want to say about 2020? Like, and what is your wisdom? Like, if you had to distill it of like what you've gotten so far from this year and perhaps your hope moving forward.
I think one of the things that's happened for me is that I've given myself permission to really have more limitation. Mm-hmm. Like, it's almost like the pathway for me to unfold in my fullness is by saying no, knowing when to say no and knowing when to say yes. That there is no price, like the price of leaving part of myself behind is non-negotiable now. That's become and that's a real shift inside of me it's changing me. And I would also say that I feel like I've come into contact with the intelligence of love, and not just the love between people, but the intelligence of love. And I really feel like for me, that's, it's not only the gift, it's like I'm waking up to something that I've always known. Mm-hmm. So what the pandemic and what all of this has done for me in getting more in touch with myself is it's actually more of a remembering than a learning something new, right? Mm-hmm. It's detaching from all the distractions that kept me, spending more time on the level of persona than the level of soul.
Yeah, totally.
How about you?
I think this time has really awakened me to embodying myself and has confronted my own spiritual bypass, my desire to spiritual bypass or do emotional bypass, and really land more in my body, land and become more human. I feel like containment is my medicine because I've been able to express myself throughout my life, despite saying I lost part of my voice. That's true. And I've still been able to express more than contain. So everything is about simplicity, structure. And that's, to me, the sacred masculine I'm bringing into the relationship with the divine feminine. I feel much more whole from coming through this year, and grateful, like, for the expedited lessons of this year, because I know we have to learn now as a species, not individually only, but as a species in quantum time, because there is no time with everything that's happening in the big cosmic narratives. And my hope going forward is, one of the things I've been saying to my clients is, how are we going to write new stories of the culture? I think it's now about getting smaller, not bigger. And by smaller, I mean more intimate.
I do too, 100%.
Sharing our deepest, most intimate stories and making the unspeakable unspeakable and moving past shame, right? That's how we're going to, those are the new stories. They're the old stories. They're also the new stories, and going deeper in that connection.
Wow. Sounds like we're moving, huh? Things are moving and shifting. And as always, it's a privilege to be here. I feel, this one feels important. That's all I'll say. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, thanks, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restorying the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restorying the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.